Well, good morning, everybody. This is Barry Jones with SP History, and this is episode 5 of the E. Howard Hunt series. And today we've been laying the groundwork in episodes 1 through 4 that E. Howard Hunt was involved with the CIA in the lead up to November 22, 1963. And of course, our introduction to E. Howard Hunt was the Watergate burglary. And so we're sort of working backwards from 72, 73, 74 back to the 60s, actually the late 50s and early 60s. And if you remember, we talked pretty extensively about Nixon. And in the Watergate tapes, he had a very great desire to hide E. Howard Hunt's past. He was one of the 7 men originally arrested after Watergate, and he said, if you uncover that scab, it'll reveal a hell of a lot. And he knew that E. Howard Hunt was, quote, the lever, the key to understanding Watergate, but also to understanding other covert operations that he was aware of going back to this time as vice president, which would be in the late 50s. So that's what we've been doing. We laid the groundwork with Watergate, and we've gone back into the late 50s, early 60s. And yesterday we got up to 1963 for episode 4, and that was as far as E. Howard Hunt specifically was involved, running or being a CIA liaison to the Operation Mongoose base down on the Everglades, and how they ignored the president's order to shut down the base and cease and desist in all their efforts related to Cuba. And E. Howard Hunt, in January of 63, ordered an assassination attempt on Castro right after that order came down from the White House. And so, the White House responded by sending down the marshals, customs officials, burning out the bases, taking all their weapons in C4, and arresting Frank Sturgis, one of them, another Watergate burglar, incidentally, and also arresting E. Howard Hunt and charging them with violations of the Neutrality Act. That was just to lay the groundwork and show how complicit uh, E. Howard Hunt was with the CIA. And it's more than complicit. He was a full-fledged ranking officer. He was an asset or an agent, um, fully immersed in all things CIA. And the rest of episode 4, I spent detailing the escalation of the war between the CIA and the White House, but including the military and the Joint Chiefs and the Cubans, and the list was long. And so by the time we get to the end of 63, the president is surrounded by enemies. And so what I want to start to do in episode 5 is show how the CIA was involved in the assassination. And ergo, if the CIA was involved, E. Howard Hunt was involved. And I'll get into specifics regarding E. Howard Hunt as we go, but let's just talk generically about the CIA and its role in the JFK assassination. What I'm going to do is point to just documented facts. Okay, I'm not going to speculate, not going to get into what I might think, uh, what hasn't already been proven or hasn't been revealed by the release of documents and witness statements, and even a civil trial, which we'll get into the case of Marita Lorenz. So let's talk about evidence. We know, and a lot of this I'm not going to expound upon in this video because I've already expounded upon it in previous videos. So I'm just going to, it's a rehash is what it is. We have evidence that Richard Nixon was involved during his time as vice president and as chair of the 5412 committee in the creation of an assassination team, which was later named the S-Force. And we know that Richard Nixon was involved because Sheffield Edwards attended the meeting at the Fontainebleau Hotel, and he did so as Nixon's representative at the meeting. You remember, Santos Trafficante said, well, I'll put this assassination team together, but I need to have assurances that the future president is involved in this. We're doing this at his request. And so, of course, Nixon couldn't attend a meeting with Sam Giancana and Santos Trafficante. So he sent in his place the chief of security for the CIA, Sheffield Edwards. That's a documented meeting that took place. Sam Giancana was there, Johnny Rosselli was there, Sheffield Edwards was there, Santos Trafficante was there. Uh, the attorney for Howard Hughes was there. And so that's Nixon's involvement. And of course, Nixon is chair of the 5412 committee, which is a subcommittee of the CIA. So by him being involved in the 5412, that means the 5412 committee is involved. By the 5412 committee being involved, that means the CIA is involved. By Sheffield Edwards' presence there, that draws in the CIA. Then, after the S-Force was created, the principal trainers of the S-Force at Murchison Ranch down in Mexico were full-time CIA agents. Carl Jenkins, William Rip Robertson. If you want to fast forward to November 22, 1963, William Rip Robertson, according to witnesses, was in Dealey Plaza on that day. Witnesses saw him there. CIA pilot Tosh Plumley, that was the doubled. He kind of fulfilled several roles. He was a pilot for mafia interests, but also for the CIA, and he doubled as the S-Force pilot, toting them around. He'd go around to the 5 bases, pick up all the 3 S-Force members from each base, 15 total, and then fly them down to Arizona and then eventually across the border to Clinton Murchison Ranch. This is a CIA guy. Okay. And then there's a series of memos written by the CIA's assassination guru, William Harvey, about the S-Force. And of course, we already know he was involved as a result of the church hearings in the mid-70s. He was involved heavily in the creation of 2 and the running of 2 separate assassination operations, one on foreign heads of state, which was called executive action, and one on a domestic target, who, according to them, was a threat to national security or worldwide peace, and that was Z.R. Rifle. That's William Harvey. And he wrote a series of memos, which have been declassified, about the S-Force. So this is simultaneous to his work on Z.R. Rifle and executive action. And so he's writing memos about the S-Force, which is an assassination team. It doesn't have a, it doesn't have a, in essence, it was an assassination team without a mission at the beginning, but at the conclusion of its training, and when the time was right, it would be folded into either ZR Rifle or executive action to either carry out a hit on a foreign head of state or a domestic target. And so this was sort of the means by which these operations would be accomplished. So of course, William Harvey was involved. There was not an assassination plot taking place during this period of time. William Harvey wasn't involved, and he's fully vested in the CIA. So if Harvey's involved, his bosses have signed off on everything he's doing. His bosses are Allen Dulles, head of the CIA. And later it was, I'm forgetting the guy's name. The guy later got convicted of lying to Congress, but I'll think of it. Anyway, these are CIA people. All 15 members of the S-Force came from Operation Mongoose. Santos was smart when he picked them back from, he'd loaned them to the government, to the CIA, for the purposes of Operation 40 and Mongoose. So they were paid by the CIA. And when they told him to put together an assassination team, he just borrowed them back. He just reclaimed them. So these were fully paid CIA assets. So any operation that they take part in is going to be with the blessing of the CIA, and because these are CIA people. All 15 members of the S-Force signed in at Fort Wakaka in Arizona as, quote, government employees. They weren't private individuals. They weren't assassins off the book. They weren't mob guys in that capacity. They were government employees. Otherwise, in other words, CIA. And then, of course, we now know, didn't know it at the time, but we now know as a result of church hearings that the CIA was engaged in a active covert op to assassinate Castro's. And of course, this was against JFK's orders. We learned about the bases and Operation Mongoose. We learned about E. Howard Hunt and his covert op in defiance of the president's order to assassinate Castro. And, uh, and of course, when the president found out about this, as I mentioned earlier, he burned out the bases. He arrested Hunt and Sturgis. And of course, this angered the CIA and its anti-Castro army of Cuban freedom fighters and mob guys. These guys are spread out all over Dallas, New Orleans, Miami. Um, but this is all a function of the CIA and its covert war against Castro and his government. And so uh, this is just to show uh, that the CIA is deeply, this is interesting. You get to the Warren Commission, and all of this was hidden from the Warren Commission. This long-running CIA war against Castro, this long-running operation to kill Castro was all hidden from the Warren Commission because they knew what it would show. Alan Dulles, who was serving basically as the head of the committee, knew that the Warren Commission found out that the CIA was trying to kill Castro for all these years and all these running operations going, that it would make the CIA, put the CIA right in the crosshairs of the investigation. So they just hid it from them. We didn't find out about it until the 70s. And then, of course, William Pauly's involvement with the S team. Remember, we learned yesterday it was his yacht, Flying Tiger II, that was transporting the assassination team. And of course, William Pauly's best friend was Alan Dulles. He was a civilian advisor to the CIA. He was an FBI informant. He had participated in previous CIA covert ops, such as executive action, assassination program, and also the Operation PB Success, which was the overthrow of the Guatemalan government. And then his assertion on the yacht in front of Bill, the Time Life reporter, that we're going to kill that motherfucker, talking about JFK, is further proof or evidence that this wasn't just some innocent guy saying this. This was a guy who was tied in very tightly with the CIA saying this. So it might as well have been the CIA saying it. And then we get to Marita Lorenz's testimony, and we're going to talk about that pretty extensively today. All that makes a pretty strong case that the CIA was involved when we get to November 22, 1963. Then we get to the actual event where on 11/22/63, witnesses spotted at least five. Now, they didn't know they were S-Force members, but when they started pointing out pictures of people saying, I saw this guy and I saw that guy, we find out that five of the people that were pointed out that were spotted in Dealey Plaza on November 22, 1963 happened to be S-Force assassins. And I've pictured them here. And if you follow clockwise from top left, you have Luis Posada Carriles. There's multiple witnesses who saw him. David Morales. And of course, we've learned previously that his spotter was actually arrested in the Dell Tech building. So we know if his spotter was there, that he spotted for David Morales. That was the team. That they were previously arrested in November 2 in Chicago in a previous assassination attempt, both of them. And the next time we see him is 20 days later in Dallas. David Morales and, of course, Jim Braden or Eugene Braden Hale, whichever alias he's going by. Guillermo Novo Sample, Frank Sturgis, who was a self-admitted CIA assassin. This is the other half of the folks, the CIA liaisons in those Operation Mongoose bases that were defying JFK's orders to close down the bases, arrested by Bobby for violation of the Neutrality Act. This is also the same guy he'll be arrested with 11 years later at Watergate, or 9 years later, or whatever it was, at Watergate. So wherever you see Frank Sturgis in a lot of these covert ops, you're going to see E. Howard Hunt. And wherever you see E. Howard Hunt, you're going to see Frank Sturgis. And Orlando Bosch, another CIA assassin on the S-Force assassin, was present in Dealey Plaza. Now, what are the odds that these assassins, all of them together, would be in the same place at the same time on the day of the highest profile assassination in the history of our country and not be involved? I mean, it defies logic, right? And of course, these are all uh, on the CIA payroll. They're all part of the S Force, all uh, former Operation Mongoose members. Also, according to witnesses, one of the original S Force organizers and the S Force pilot were both in Dallas on November 22, 1963. Johnny Rosselli, pictured at the top, was flown in by Tosh Plumley, pictured at the bottom with the red circle. Um, this is Tosh Plumley even admitted this. So there's multiple witnesses to Tosh Plumley flying in Johnny Rosselli. And of course, according to some witnesses, it wasn't just Johnny Rosselli on that plane, it was Sam Giancana as well, who was also one of the original S-Force organizers, all working. And these are mob guys slash CIA, because in those days, when it came to Cuba, when it came to anything related to Operation Mongoose, the mob and the CIA and even the Cubans were like the Holy Trinity. They were all together working towards the same goal. So you couldn't say, and of course, the CIA was the most important member of that because they were the deciders, they were the paymasters. The mob and the Cubans were sort of the guys who did all the dirty work, but they were all working together. Um, then you get to Oswald and the extensive connections that the guy accused of the crime has to the CIA, uh, starting with that Sugi and his job there, or his recruitment, first of all, into intelligence. That earlier, he had been recruited when he started in the Marine Corps. He'd been recruited into intelligence, ONI, on behalf of the CIA. And he got Russian language training, and in preparation for his mission to Russia, where he was posing as a fake defector. And at Sugi, he worked in the U-2 program while he was acting Russian, going to the Queen Bee, uh, feeding disinformation to these Russian hostesses, these Russian spy hostesses, what he was doing. All of this on behalf of the CIA. And then you follow through to the summer of 63 after he gets back from Russia and all the goings on in New Orleans. His handler is Guy Bannister, who's working on behalf of the CIA in Operation Mongoose. And he's involved in all this training of these Operation Mongoose Cuban refugees at the two Lake Pontchartrain bases. Uh, Half the time he's posing as a anti-Castro Operation Mongoose operator. The other half the time he's posing as a pro-Castro Fair Play for Cuba Castro sympathizer. And this is all part of the sheep dipping effort by the CIA to set him up as the patsy. It's all masterminded by the CIA. He's not making up any of these decisions on his own. He's not setting his own agenda. He's doing what he's told. He reports to the Newman building every morning, and Guy Bannister tells him what he's doing that day. And then after he gets arrested, he didn't make a phone call to his mom. You get one phone call. He doesn't make a phone call to his mom, to an uncle or somebody who could bail him out. He makes a phone call to Raleigh, North Carolina, to his handler, the guy who had, excuse me, been his CIA contact if he ever gets in trouble. And it's to an area right near Nags Head, North Carolina, where they had the base that trained all the fake defectors. So all the fake defectors that went to Russia came from this area where they got their training to go to Russia and pose as a fake defector and carry out their mission. And later, it's standard operating procedure for these assets. If they ever get themselves in trouble, they make a phone call to this contact. It's cutout, basically, is what it is. And then he forwards the message on to his handler, and they decide what they're going to do with him. So, we didn't find out about this till years later. I think it was during the House Select Committee hearing when a lady in the jail had picked up the piece of paper that had been thrown in the trash, indicating it was the call slip indicating that Lee Harvey Oswald had tried to make a collect phone call to this person in Raleigh, North Carolina. And that's a pretty important little detail, indicating that he had orders that he was following. He was following procedure in that instance. He wasn't stepping out calling his family. And so this is clear indication of CIA involvement. And then, of course, this very famous memo, John McCone, who became the CIA director in 64. And he is responding to a Secret Service request for information about Lee Harvey Oswald. And if you read this memo, the highlighted portions, he just flat out states it that this guy, Lee Harvey Oswald, was in the CIA. He was recruited by ONI for a Russian assignment, a special assignment in Russia. And he even named the town Minsk, where he would be living. And and uh, and it's boy, documented evidence from the CIA director that Lee Harvey Oswald was part of the CIA and he was recruited to take part in this fake defector program. And so, it's anybody who wants to claim that Lee Harvey Oswald was some low nut that just, uh, first of all, killed the president. The evidence for that is so weak and on its face, it's almost laughable now, 60 years later. But what's not laughable, what's not weak, is evidence that this guy, Lee Harvey Oswald, was tied in to the CIA and was set up by the CIA to be the patsy, which is what he eventually became. Uh, the case for CIA involvement continues with the concoction of this this is what the CIA does. They misinform or they spread disinformation. Their whole purpose for existence is to fool people or to deceive people. They lie. That's what they do. And they manufactured this story, in this case, about Lee Harvey Oswald and about him going to Mexico City and that he had met with the chief of assassinations for the Russians at the Russian embassy, Kostakov, and that he had tried to get papers so he could go to Russia or to Cuba after the assassination, planning his getaway. It was all manufactured evidence. They said they had tape recordings of his voice in phone conversations. When they produced those tape recordings, the FBI listened to him, so well, that's not his voice. So then all of a sudden the recordings disappeared and they said, all we have left are the transcripts. Of course they disappeared. Then they said they had photos of him arriving and leaving the embassies. And when they produced the photos, it was of this guy. And I don't know, I mean, you have to be an idiot to look at that picture of that guy and say that's Lee Harvey Oswald. Doesn't even look like him. And so pretty quickly, their story, their disinformation campaign fell apart. By the way, this was all orchestrated. The Mexico City station chief of the CIA was David Atlee Phillips. What was David Atlee Phillips, besides being station chief of the Mexico City station and also being Western Hemisphere chief? What was his expertise at the CIA? It was disinformation. That's what he'd done for years. That's how he rose through the ranks. So David Atlee Phillips put together this weak disinformation campaign to add or pile on evidence that Lee Harvey Oswald, in the month before the assassination, was in Mexico City meeting with prominent Russians, prominent Cubans, planning his getaway and planning the assassination, possibly doing it on behalf of the Cuban government and or the Russians. And, this was all in an effort to inflame the American people and lead to a war between us and the Cubans or us and the Russians. That was their ultimate objective. The guy standing in the way was always JFK. And so this is basically Operation Northwoods. If you remember Operation Northwoods, that was the proposal by the CIA and the Joint Chiefs together to launch terrorist attacks against American citizens, American targets, whether it be shopping malls or jetliners or ships or whatever, and then lay the blame at the feet of the Cubans and or the Russians, whichever, it didn't matter. They were basically one and the same, to lead to a war. It was a false flag. And when Kennedy laughed at it and said, no way, they just filed it away and says, well, we'll use it with or without your permission. And I believe the JFK assassination was their Operation Northwoods. You can't get a more prominent American target than the President of the United States. And who gets blamed immediately? Lee Harvey Oswald. And what do they point to? His affiliation with the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, his alleged visit to the Cuban embassy and the Russian embassies down in Mexico City, his meeting with these Cubans and Russians planning an assassination, planning his getaway. They're laying the blame at the feet of the Cubans and the Russians. It's Operation Northwoods. And so I believe we when Kennedy rejected it out of hand, the assumption was it never happened because the president vetoed it. But I believe it did happen. I believe I've shown a pattern of CIA defiance of presidential orders whereby the president would say close down the base and they wouldn't close down the base. The president would say cease and desist in all your meddling in Cuban affairs, and they would, instead of ceasing and desisting, they would continue and launch new attacks. And when the president said don't try to assassinate Castro, they would launch new operations to assassinate Castro. They disobeyed every order that he gave. Why would they obey suddenly his veto of Operation Northwoods? It's just a simple switch of the targets, right? You just change the target. Instead of the target being Castro in Cuba, you make the target an American target, a prominent American target, just like Operation Northwoods called for. And instead of it being a shopping mall or a jetliner, you just make the target JFK and you kill two birds with one stone. You get the obstacle to all your plans out of the way, and you get the false flag that you want to justify a war against Cuba or the Russians. I mean, it was laid out beautifully. It's amazing we didn't end up in a war. Then you look at the wounds. More proof that the CIA was involved in it because the wounds were not, if a lone gunman had done all the shooting from behind and above, all the wounds to JFK and Connolly, etc., would have been consistent with that, with both trajectory and direction, but they weren't. JFK had wounds to the front, the side, and behind. The first shot that hit him square in the neck, right through the front windshield. That's a front shot. The shot that hit him in the back was from behind and above, but then the shot that took off his head was from the side front. And they weren't, none of these wounds were perpetrated by somebody at close range. Somebody was using high-powered rifles from distance, meaning they were using scopes. And of course, they were targeting a motorcade, which is a moving target. All of this is consistent with the Triangular Fire Team, which is the S-Force, did all their training down at the Murchison family estate in Mexico using high-powered rifles and scopes, shooting at a moving target from distance. That's their training. And that's exactly, and it was triangulated, meaning it was coming from three directions. All of that is consistent exactly with what happened in Dallas. And so I believe, and of course, that was a CIA operation. It was trained by, these people were trained by the CIA. It was run by Bill Harvey. And then not only did the CIA, as far as carrying out the hit and all the mechanics that we just discussed, they were there. All these CIA people were there. We've already established, according to witnesses, that Luis Posada Carriles was there. He's an S-Force assassin. We've already established that Guillermo Nova Sampo, an S-Force assassin, was there. According to eyewitnesses, we've already established that Orlando Bosch was there. We've already established that Frank Sturgis was there. Now, Bosch, Sampo, and Carriles are Cubans working for the CIA as basically assassins or mechanics, but Frank Sturgis was a fully immersed CIA officer. I don't know, they call them officers, assets, agent, whatever. He was Cuban, but he was a full-fledged CIA assassin, and self-admitted. And these people are all there. In addition, Johnny Rosselli was there. Johnny Rosselli was the CIA mob liaison for all things related to Cuba and the Operation Mongoose and the S-Force, et cetera, et cetera. Tosh Plumley was the S-Force pilot, worked for the CIA and the mob. E. Howard Hunt. Okay, we're finally to E. Howard Hunt. Now, E. Howard Hunt denied for years that he was there. When his face got splashed all over the papers as a result of Watergate, all of a sudden Nixon got real paranoid about E. Howard Hunt. And that's evidence. Just go listen to the tapes. He talks about E. Howard Hunt constantly. And it wasn't in relation to Watergate. It was relation. He was related. He kept talking about the Bay of Pigs guys. He kept talking about the Cuba thing. He kept talking about what went on in Mexico. And what he was talking about was the S Force and the training that was taking place. You remember, he initiated that whole thing. Howard Hunt was the liaison for the S Force at Everglades, and he knew that a full investigation of Howard Hunt. Now, it's interesting to me, he never really mentioned Frank Sturgis in the same uh, with the same concern. It was always Howard Hunt, which I've always wondered about. But anyway, because Frank Sturgis was as deeply involved in the S Force as Howard Hunt was. And he was one of the Watergate burglars arrested as well. You'd think he'd be worried about both of them. Maybe he was. He just always said E. Howard Hunt. I don't know, but he constantly talked about E. Howard Hunt. And of course, he didn't have any. Why would he be concerned about Bay of Pigs? That happened on JFK's watch, and we found out during the Watergate hearings, as a result of his chief of staff, Haldeman, said, well, whenever he talked about the Bay of Pigs, he was actually talking about the JFK assassination. So boom, instantly, you have in Nixon's own words, he's concerned about E. Howard Hunt because it will lead back to Bay of Pigs. And according to Haldeman, that means JFK assassination. And he had said in an earlier tape, this was an operation that he was involved in. And it was a very covert or secret operation, very sensitive, and it operated south of the border, which is down in Murchison's estate. That's where they did all the training. So if you put all those together, those are puzzle pieces. If you put the puzzle pieces together, the puzzle is complete. Nixon was concerned that any investigation of E. Howard Hunt would lead back to the assassination team that he put together, that he believed, and is proven by how many of these S-Force members were in Dealey Plaza that day, that it was his assassination team that he put together, that he initiated, that he lost control of when he lost the election in 60, that eventually assassinated President Kennedy in 63. And that, if that ever got out, it would be impossible for him to go forward politically in America. It would be impossible for him to explain to the American people that he didn't kill JFK. And he knew that. That's what he was so concerned about. Well, for years, E. Howard Hunt kept silent about his role in the JFK assassination, denied that he was ever there. Deny. But there were all kinds of evidences that he was there. And finally, right before he died, he confessed to his son and to a news reporter. And he even wrote out a flow chart of who gave the order and where he fit in the whole scheme. And he said he was, quote, a bench warmer for the big event. The big event was the assassination, and he was there. He was there, and he admitted it. And so now, and of course, we already knew that he was there, right? If Frank Sturgis was there, E. Howard Hunt was there. And so, you find out that here's another CIA guy. He's as deeply immersed in the CIA as Frank Sturgis. He was there. He denied it for all them years, but he finally admitted it. So we know, for a matter of fact, the CIA was there. Now, this doesn't really have anything to do with the CIA necessarily, but Richard Nixon was there. Now, Richard Nixon wasn't part of the CIA, but he ran the 5412 committee when he was vice president, which means he ran the covert ops that the CIA was involved in. And here he is, voila, showing up in Dallas at a Pepsi Cola bottling convention. We know he was there because he actually was interviewed by the Dallas Morning News. And here's a copy of the article where he's predicting that JFK is going to drop Johnson from the ticket, et cetera, et cetera. He was there that day. Bill Harvey was there, not on that day. Okay, I want to be real clear about that. But he had been, his role in all of these assassination programs, S-Force, et cetera, et cetera. When Kennedy found out about it, the Kennedy brothers, they were furious with Harvey. And so they decided to punish him, and they sent him to Rome, Italy to be the CIA station chief there. And they thought, well, he can't cause any trouble over there. But this is the head of the ZR rifle team, which is the S-Force operation to kill Castro. Allegedly, we found out later, it wasn't to kill Castro, it was to kill an American target, a domestic target. Executive action was to kill a foreign target. in charge of two assassination programs or operations simultaneously, Executive Action and ZR Rifle. He was heavily involved in Operation 40, heavily involved in Operation Mongoose, and as evidenced by his memos where he's talking about the S Force, he was heavily involved in the S Force, the training of the assassination team that would eventually kill JFK. Um, According to the family jewels, which were released by the uh, the two CIA directors to the Church Committee, Harvey was involved in every assassination the CIA ever participated in. I mean, that's what he does. That's his area of expertise. So anytime Harvey's involved in anything covert, you can bet your bottom dollar there's an assassination involved in it in some manner, shape, form. Anyway, John Witten famously said when he was investigating Harvey for the House Select Committee, just to kind of cast the image of who this guy was, he said, quote, Harvey was too young to have assassinated McKinley and Lincoln. So, I mean, it's sort of a sarcastic way to characterize William Harvey and what his area of expertise was. If there was an assassination, Harvey was involved. Anyway, in November of 63, according to several of the folks that worked in the Rome, Italy CIA station, Harvey flew from Italy to Dallas in November of 63 to, quote, look around. They asked him, why are you going to Dallas? We have nothing going on in Dallas that we know of. What's your level of interest? What's your interest in Dallas? And he told them, I'm going there to look around. This was in November. I don't have the dates. I just know it was November of 63. So it was, it had to be November 22, 1963. It's 3 weeks in. So it was within a 3 week span or 3 week period of JFK going to Dallas and being assassinated. William Harvey was there. What does that tell you? You don't have to be a super sleuth to figure out what that means. This is the famous flow chart that E. Howard Hunt wrote on his deathbed. And you can see where he put the players. And at the top, he put LBJ. He said LBJ was the key cog in all of this. He was the decider. And he was the guy who was going to make sure everybody got away with it because he'd be the president. He would appoint the Warren Commission. He would decide who was going to be on the Warren Commission. He'd tie off any investigation in Texas because he was the head honcho in Texas. His best friend was John Connally. He would get JFK to Dallas, arrange the motorcade, arrange all his best friends. Some of his best friends were high-ranking officers in the Secret Service, so he could arrange the security to be stripped away. You can go on and on. I did a whole series on LBJ and his involvement with the JFK assassination. Underneath LBJ, you had Cord Meyer. Cord Meyer was the husband of the Mary Pinchot Meyer, who had the affair with JFK when he was a senator. He was a CIA officer. Under him were two assassins. You see David Morales, Bill Harvey. He's just listing people involved in the flow chart. And then underneath that, E. Howard Hunt had the French assassin or the French gunman. I think that says French gunman on the grassy knoll. It's interesting. In my research of the JFK assassination, the government says all the shooting came from behind and above the Texas School Book Depository. But as researchers have dug and dug, more and more people have come out, and it's become more acceptable to say, no, the fatal shot came from behind the picket fence on the grassy knoll. And all of a sudden, we get all these people saying that they were the ones who did it. James Files, a Chicago assassin representing the Chicago crime family, said he was the one behind the picket fence. Here you have E. Howard Hunt saying it was the French gunman, Sarti, who later ended up in prison, never admitted to it himself. He said it was the French gunman. The lawyers who worked for LBJ and some of the folks who got tied up with him and some of his scandals such as Billy Saul Estes and Bobby Baker, they said it was LBJ's gunman or his personal assassin, Mac Wallace, who was behind the picket fence. Mac Wallace never admitted to that. Mac Wallace's fingerprint was found in the sniper's nest of the Texas School Book Depository. I believe Mac Wallace was involved, but I believe he was actually in the Texas School Book Depository. Now, there are other witnesses who saw somebody fitting his description in the Texas School Book Depository. And then you have the story of Roscoe White, the Dallas policeman slash CIA asset who got hired on the Dallas Police Department in September of that year and confessed to it after his death in some stuff that he had stored away in his footlocker. So there's all these people claiming to be the assassin behind the picket fence. I believe personally it was Roscoe White. I think the evidence shows corroboration beyond a shadow of a doubt that it was Roscoe White there. I mean, two people saw him personally, identified him as being in his uniform, his police uniform, and coming out from behind the picket fence in the seconds, and I mean seconds after the shooting. And those two people, Bobby Hargis was one of them. The Dallas police officer who was on one of the motorcycles, he ran up there, and then Beverly Oliver, who knew Roscoe White because she was friends with this Roscoe White's wife, Geneva, and said clearly it was Geneva's husband who came out from behind the fence. Bobby Hargis obviously knew him because he was a fellow Dallas police officer, and so when he ran up there, he ran into Roscoe White, who was in his police uniform, et cetera, et cetera. Anyway, that's a long answer or a long explanation to whom I think was there. But that's, I can't say that definitively. But anyway, E. Howard Hunt said it was the French gunman who was behind the picket fence on the grassy knoll. But clearly what you start to see is this consensus building that the fatal shot didn't come from the Texas School Book Depository. Whether it was James Files, whether it was the French gunman, whether it was Mac Wallace, whether it was Roscoe White, or somebody else, the fatal shot came from behind the picket fence. According to Hunt, he was a bench warmer, which means he was a ready and willing substitute if necessary, and that LBJ had signed off on the assassination. So clearly, if E. Howard Hunt is saying this, he has knowledge, and he's a CIA officer. So if E. Howard Hunt knows this, the CIA knows this. But it gets even better, and the evidence gets stronger because of the story of Marita Lorenz. Marita Lorenz, and I did some videos on hers. I did an entire video on her as well, so I won't get into too much detail, but she was a former spy for the CIA who actually had been given the assignment of, because she was a former girlfriend also of Fidel Castro and actually had a baby with him, so she could get close to him. And so they had given her a poison pill and she'd snuck it, smuggled it into Cuba in her face cream. And then she chickened out, and turned out it wouldn't have worked anyway because when she put the poison pill in her face cream, the face cream dissolved the poison pill. And so she failed in her mission to kill Castro. When she came back to America, according to her story, she was a CIA asset working in other capacities, not directly related to the assassination of Castro, but directly involved in Operation Mongoose. She lived in Miami. And anyway, the story is that Liberty Lobby, a newspaper, a conservative newspaper called The Spotlight, and Liberty Lobby owned this newspaper, The Spotlight, and they wrote a story in the 80s alleging that E. Howard Hunt was involved in the conspiracy to kill JFK. Well, E. Howard Hunt was still in his denial mode, so he sued for defamation the Spotlight. And of course, by suing the Spotlight, he's really suing Liberty Lobby. And so this is when, the way the story went was he won the lawsuit, and he got a big settlement. Well, Liberty Lobby decided to appeal. And of course, these things take years and years. And they hired Mark Lane to help them in their preparation of their case, of their appeal. And he found Marita Lorenz. Of course, Mark Lane is a prominent JFK researcher, in addition to being a legal scholar and a lawyer. And he's the guy that put on a fake case to represent, to give Lee Harvey Oswald the defense he never gave or never got because he was killed. And so this guy was deeply involved in all things related to the JFK assassination. He knew about Marita Lorenz. And in preparation for this case, he decided, boy, this would be a primo witness to help in this case because she has knowledge of E. Howard Hunt. And so he brings Marita Lorenz to the appeal, and she starts telling her story. And the story was that she had met Castro at age 19. Her dad was a ship captain, and she became his mistress. And she's she lived in Manhattan, but Castro, when she was 19, flew her back to Havana, and they started having this love affair, and she got pregnant. And at 7 months along, she was drugged and taken to the hospital. And when she came to, the baby had been delivered, and she was told that the baby had been aborted. And her knowledge of the situation for years afterwards was that her baby had died. And she fled Cuba afterwards. She was very distraught. She suspected that the baby had been killed, and at the orders of Castro. And of course, that caused an estrangement between the two. And she uh, joined the anti-Castro forces in Florida in 1960. She was actually recruited because they thought, here's somebody, we've been trying all these times to assassinate Castro. We can't get close to him. But here's a former girlfriend. And yes, they're estranged right now, but there's a possibility that she could, rekindle this lost love with Castro and at least get close enough to him to assassinate him. And so they recruited her to do that. And I told you the story. And of course, it didn't work. And she, in 63, she, according to her testimony, she was a contract employee at the CIA. So this is after the assassination attempt. And she'd been recruited at a Miami meeting as a contract employee of the CIA to participate in a particular mission. And the person that recruited her into this particular mission was Frank Sturgis. This is her testimony. So she's telling the story of how she met Castro and how she got pregnant and had this love affair. Then she lost the baby. She found out later she didn't lose the baby. But at that moment, she thought she'd lost the baby. She was estranged. She fled to Manhattan. She fled to America, lived in Miami. The CIA got wind of her. Here's Castro's ex-girlfriend. And they decided to use her to try to, basically to exploit her, get her close to Castro, and use this poison pill and assassinate him. She chickens out. She comes back. She's failed in her mission. So they decide, well, we'll use her in these other ways. And then in 63, she's been working as a contract employee, so she knows Frank Sturgis. She has contacts with him. She's probably carried out other missions relating to Operation Mongoose with Frank Sturgis. And in 63, he recruits her to this particular mission. And he describes it to her as a, quote, off-the-board operation. And she said that in her time working with Frank Sturgis on this, quote, off-the-board operation, she personally witnessed Sturgis getting cash payments from E. Howard Hunt, whom she also knew. And so this is the same cast of characters. She's thinking nothing about it. And because she, Sturgis, and Hunt had all been part of Operation 40 going back into the late 50s. So this is the same cast of characters in 63 as it was in the late 50s. Nothing new. And so she's participating in this off-the-board operation, which included a trip to Dallas. And she describes this trip. She said it was on November 21st. They arrived in Dallas with a trunk full of weapons. Now, this wasn't unusual. They had run guns. A lot of what Operation Mongoose was transporting weapons across state lines, getting them into the hands of the Cuban exiles where they could be trained for this eventual invasion that was going to take place. She didn't think much about it. But when she got to Dallas with Sturgis, they met E. Howard Hunt in a Dallas hotel room. This is further corroboration that E. Howard Hunt was in Dallas. So we're not just going by his deathbed confession. Marita Lorenz says, no, we went to Dallas. We met E. Howard Hunt in a Dallas hotel room where Hunt paid Sturgis cash money for the weapons. And she says that while they were there in the hotel room, there was a knock on the door. They all turned around, opened the door, and Jack Ruby was standing there. And she remembers this interaction with Jack Ruby because Jack Ruby knew everybody in the room except her. And he actually got mad at E. Howard Hunt and said, what is she doing here? Why'd you bring her into this? And all of a sudden, Marita Lorenz got cold feet. And she said, because of the reaction that Jack Ruby had to her presence there, no one had ever objected to her presence in any of these Operation Mongoose uh, goings on before. But now all of a sudden, Jack Ruby was furious. They had this verbal altercation. And she goes, I knew this was different from other jobs. This was not just gun running. This was big, very big. And I wanted to get out. I told Sturgis I wanted to leave. He said it was a very big operation, but that my part was not dangerous. I was to be a decoy. Remember, if you followed me at all on previous videos, I've told you time and again, the CIA's number one method in all these kinds of operations is to create diversion by use of decoys and patsies. Okay, so she was going to be a decoy. Anyway, she continues. Before he could go further, I said, please let me get out. I want to get back to my baby in Miami. This was a second child she had with another lover later after Castro. Finally, he agreed and he drove me to the airport. So if that was the end of the story, her testimony wouldn't be as explosive as it turned out to be. But it wasn't the end of the story because the next day, November 22, JFK gets assassinated. Remember now, she was in Dallas on November 21st and she flew home that night. According to her testimony, there's never been a case brought, whether criminal or civil, in the case of the JFK assassination, except in this Marita Lorenz case. It's the only case. So it's the only time that jurors have heard somebody's testimony incriminating either the CIA or somebody in the CIA. So the question is, are they going to believe it or not? Is it credible? So she reported after JFK was assassinated, she said she went to the FBI and told them everything that she is saying, the story that I'm telling you right now, that she's saying in this trial. She told the FBI that, and she said, quote, the FBI didn't want to know because those were CIA activities, not FBI. So they ignored her. It's kind of like Ed Hoffman when he went to the FBI. The FBI didn't want to listen to Ed Hoffman either, right? Anybody who had anything to say that didn't fit the government narrative, they didn't want to hear it. And so Lorenz continued. She said that Sturgis later came back to Miami and he bragged to her, quote, we killed the president that day. You could have been a part of it, part of history. You should have stayed. It was safe. Everything was covered in advance. No arrests, no real newspaper investigation. It was all covered, very professional. Holy cow. I mean, you talk about a bombshell. So, Mark Lane bringing her into this case was the best thing that ever happened to Liberty Lobby because the jury turns around and reverses the case. They rule in favor of the defendant, Liberty Lobby. And according to the jury foreperson who was interviewed later, Leslie Armstrong, quote, the evidence clearly demonstrated that Hunt and the CIA assassinated President Kennedy. This is an officer of the court, the jury foreperson, who is in a position to hear all the evidence, determine the credibility of the witnesses, and their determination by a unanimous vote was that Hunt and the CIA assassinated President Kennedy. Now, show me where you see this in the news. It was not widely reported. You don't find it in any history book because it was this penny-ante little civil lawsuit. It wasn't a criminal proceeding. And but it's all we have to go on, other than E. Howard Hunt's own confession, which they took a video, sort of like a deposition of E. Howard Hunt. He's lying there dying, and these are his dying words. So this is his deathbed confession in 2007. This is the guy who Americans first found out about when this covert operator who operated in the shadows all of a sudden wasn't in the shadows anymore because of Watergate. And he ends up making this this deathbed confession to his son St. John and to writer Eric Hamburg in 2004. And and of course later the CIA sort of washed their hands of E. Howard Hunt as well because this is what we call the uh, oh, I forget the term for it when you release a little bit of information. Uh, the CIA does this from time to time. Limited hangout. It's called a limited hangout. When it became untenable to deny that E. Howard Hunt had any role in the JFK assassination, and of course that means the CIA had a role in the assassination. The CIA's limited hangout years later was, well, yes, E. Howard Hunt was involved. He was there in Dallas. It's clear. The evidence shows. But he was a rogue operator. It wasn't the CIA as an institution involved in the assassination. There were a few rogue operators who went off on their own, acting as lone rangers, and they did it. This is what the CIA does in order to remain credible. They they change the story a little bit, but they always protect themselves. And if it means they have to hang out one of their own to they'll do so. It's called limited hangout. That's what they ended up doing eventually. Uh, because Watergate, once he was convicted in the eyes of the American people for Watergate, it became impossible to defend him about JFK. So they just washed their hands of it. So there's been some talk about the tramps, that famous photo of the tramps being marched through Dealey Plaza, and whether or not E. Howard Hunt was one of the tramps. The suspicion was that he was Tramp C, the third one. I don't believe he was. I believe there is a resemblance. You can see E. Howard Hunt there on the right, Tramp C on the left. There is a vague resemblance there, but I don't believe that he was Tramp C. Uh, I believe Tramp C was actually Chauncey Holt. I'm going to be doing a series on Chauncey Holt here soon, and so we'll talk more about the three tramps in that photo at that time. But you can see if you itemize these people and their role in the JFK assassination and their connections to the CIA, my goodness, LBJ was the sitting vice president at the time of the assassination, which means he's in control of the 5412 committee, right? It's the vice president who's controlled. Nixon started off, but when JFK won the election in 60, we have a new vice president, so LBJ is in control of covert ops at the CIA. So in that capacity, LBJ has a connection to the CIA. He runs the covert ops as head of the 5412 committee. Cord Meyer was in charge of this fake defector program and involved in Operation 40. And of course, the fake defector program would connect to Lee Harvey Oswald. Operation 40 connects to Bill Harvey and all these assassination programs or operations. David Morales was a CIA assassin, self-confessed CIA assassin. Bill Harvey ran all the CIA assassination programs. Okay, and then you have the assassin, whether it was the French gunman, whether it was who would be a mob connected guy, or if it was James Files, another mob connected guy, or whether it was Mac Wallace, who would be an LBJ connected guy, or it was Roscoe White, whom I believe it was, and that was a CIA connected guy. So everywhere you look, in every step of this plot, whether eyewitnesses saw these assassins milling around on Dealey Plaza, or you get these confessions from E. Howard Hunt and who was involved, or you you have these Marita Lorenz talking about the story of how they went to Dallas with the guns, and the next day the assassination happened. And when they were there, she met with Jack Ruby, she met with E. Howard Hunt, Frank Sturgis. All these people were there. I mean, it's clear that the CIA was involved. And if the CIA was involved, it's clear that E. Howard Hunt was involved. So going back to Watergate and Nixon's concern of an honest investigation of E. Howard Hunt's past and all his involvements in previous CIA covert operations, you can see why he was so concerned about E. Howard Hunt in his history. He he was desperate. People think he was trying to cover up Watergate. Far from it. He was trying to cover up an assassination of JFK. He was fully prepared to fall on his sword for Watergate if that could spare him any liability with respect to the JFK assassination and to the S Force. And of course, E. Howard Hunt and Frank Sturgis, those were connectors. Those were connectors. So the cover up, when you get to Watergate, was not so much about covering up Watergate. They thought, you know, if we can keep that to the five burglars and the two lookouts, and maybe Haldeman and Ehrlichman and John Dean, et cetera, I can save myself. You know, dirty trick gone bad. I can't come back from, I can't recover from any knowledge of the S-File. And then when it became apparent he couldn't save himself and that this investigation was going to continue until such time there was a trial, a Senate impeachment trial, which you don't know, you can't predict what happens in a trial, what a witness is going to say, what evidence might lead to what. To tie all that off to prevent a trial, he resigned. Not so much because he was so concerned about what might come out about Watergate. American people pretty much knew what Watergate was about. At least they thought it. They did. What they didn't know, and what they didn't want, and what the plotters of Watergate didn't want anyone to know about, was how far back this goes. All these covert ops and how connected it was to the JFK assassination. And you always have clues, and the biggest, most obvious clue, and Nixon picked up on it right away, was E. Howard Hunt. All right, that's episode 5. We have one more episode to tie off the E. Howard Hunt stuff, and I'll include that later. But anyway, that's episode 5. I appreciate you all listening, and feel free to comment when you see this, or shoot me an email or a message, whatever. And if you have any more information you think I should have access to or knowledge of to include in the future with respect to E. Howard Hunt, I appreciate it. Thank you. Everybody have a great day. God bless.